The actual physical way I begin a painting, I find an object that I like, which in my most recent painting is a lobster. And then this all begins with doing a small drawing, which I then make into a full-scale drawing. The lobster might suggest a background. The redness of the lobster might suggest a background, which in this case was yellow, which then leads to A, B, C, D. Suggests another object, suggests another object, suggests another object. And then, lo and behold, at the end of like 2 to 3 weeks, I have a finished composition. And this is all in a collage state. And then I proceed to take a very accurate tracing of that and transfer it, same size, onto a canvas. And then laboriously do the same thing over again, except this time in paint. But I've always loved the idea of the armor, the red armor around the lobster. And I've long been fascinated by the way one thing slots into another in terms of the lobster architecture. Because that's the way my paintings work. One thing slots into another and suggests another thing. I used to have a system based on Reverend Roussel's system, which is the linguistic system, where one word would suggest another word, or he would reconcile a group of words. But that was 30 years ago. And then, I think it was 75, I saw the Richard Tuttle retrospective at the Whitney, the controversial one. And then I started making little Richard Tuttles for about a week, little abstracts. And which eventually, on the 7th day, turned into shovels and chandeliers. And these were little drawings. And then I started doing a little painting, like 4 inches by 4 inches, of an electric fire. And the rest is history, as they say. But it was about Richard Tuttle, who I think is one of the most poetic artists in America, who got me painting. Paradoxically, I tend to like artists who are nothing like me at all. And the same goes for movies. People see movies and say, "Oh, Trevor would love this movie." But it's the sort of thing that when I go and see, I just absolutely loathe. But I began although I now paint very flat, I began as quite a sensuous painter when I was younger, and I loved John Bradby, who's a name who's like lost to history at this point, but he was a kitchen sink painter, and he ladled the paint on, and it was gorgeous and thick and sensuous. And I tried it for a while when I was a student, but I realized you need a vast fortune in order to paint like that, because it's so expensive. And what happened was, how I began really to paint flatly was I used less and less paint and more turpentine until after several months I was just painting in a turpentine wash because I just had a tiny bit of paint left. I was always fascinated as a young child, and I think this goes back to the age of like 9 or 10, by color as it was reproduced in magazines or on cheap newsprint. So it's like bright but slightly washed out. In fact, my own color always has a slight tinge of white to every color, and a slight tinge of black, believe it or not, like in newsprint. But it's not. It's like bright color, but it's slightly subdued, which has always been my aim. Another thing is I was always fascinated by Technicolor as a child. So that's had a horrible influence as well. I always remember Rudy Burkhardt, maybe about 20 years ago, went to one of my shows, and I saw him afterwards in the street, and I said, "Which of my paintings did you like best? Or which one or 2 or 3 did you like best?" And he said, "Well, the one with the red triangle at the bottom that was on like a yellowish ground, and then there was a bit of blue on the in the center, and then there were like red stripes down the left side." He described it, in other words, not as a man with a fish on his head, as it was, but in purely formal, abstract terms. And that's when I thought, oh, stereoscopic view. You can see one thing or the other simultaneously, hopefully. But some of my favorite paintings of the 20th century are analytical cubist paintings, Picasso and Braque, which, as you probably know, are like dirt oil colors, browns and greys and blacks and whites. But once I tried to do something like that, maybe like 20 years ago, and it turns out to be the most difficult painting I ever did. Because to work on a very limited palette is almost beyond me. I'd rather work in small, slightly awkward situations. And I always work flat. I always work on a kitchen table or a house table, as I do here. And but this demands analysis from Freud, I think, because I always work at the edge of the table and slightly coming off the edge of the table. And I can't quite explain this, but I had a huge table up at Yaddo 2 summers ago, and after the third day I realized I'd moved everything to the side of the table and was actually overlapping the table, and the rest of the table was empty. But I can't quite understand why I do things like that. I'm always working towards a show, but whether I have a show or not is it's totally unimportant. But otherwise I just sit around doing nothing unless I have a goal in mind. And I have in the past done a series, well, more than one series of, let's say, vocations, which was large paintings based on vocations, one of which I'll show you later. But like a gypsy, a poet, a painter, a policeman, a navigator, and then I've done others based on, the last 2 or 3 years I've been working on still lifes, which is a subject I've been very fascinated with, because one of my favorite painters is Chardin, although my paintings do not look like Chardin. And now I'm sort of casting around for something else to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. It's like what I've just been saying is like I have no idea what's coming up next.